Welcome to our latest explainer. Today, we're descending straight into the dark, graphic novel-style kingdom of our own minds to uncover the raw, unfiltered truth of human existence. We're taking a philosophical deep dive into a grim, gothic fable, one absolutely steeped in Nietzschean concepts that maps out the very architecture of our inner world. So let's jump right in and meet the rather intimidating protagonist of our psychological journey. We begin with the jarring voice of the honest guest. He's often called the ugliest man, and he comes crashing into our consciousness specifically to challenge our sterile, comfortable dogmas. He announces, "I am the monstrum, the beast that shatters the precious stained glass of our carefully constructed lives." But here's the thing, he isn't a villain. He's actually the embodiment of the raw truth of existence, the pain, the tragedy, the deep hunger. The ego tries so desperately to ignore him, but eventually, he just refuses to be hidden any longer. Now, what does this mean for us? Well, this explainer is charting a journey of individuation. It tracks exactly how the ego uses heavy defensive mechanisms to avoid the primal unconscious. This is our true north for the whole analysis. You see, the honest guest represents shadow integration and true psychological growth. The trials he faces in this dark kingdom, they're literally the trials we all face when we finally attempt to integrate our deepest, darkest truths into our waking lives, rather than just repressing them. To really unpack this fable, we're going to use what you might call a philological archaeology to dig through the story, analyzing how the very words we use end up building our mental prisons. Philology is the study of language in historical sources. By looking at ancient roots like anima for vital spirit or the root los for loosening, we can effectively excavate the psyche. It's a wildly fascinating way to see how language maps directly onto the ego's defense mechanisms. Okay, let's get into Trial 1, the Clockwork Sovereign and Digital Decay. Our first trial plunges us into the incredibly sterile domain of the Clockwork Sovereign. He's this alchemist who is just desperate for absolute control. This is the trial of quantification, right? Where the ego tries to manage the chaos of life by measuring it to death. Notice how his desperate need to map existence with gears of perfect data completely clashes with the messy, vital reality of the honest guest. The sovereign is a sort of Faustian Übermensch trying to optimize eternity. But the guest? He brings the messy pulse of being, blood that actually feels pain. The primal truth simply cannot be contained by sterile calculation. And because he traded his warm blood for cold calculation, the sovereign's mechanical limbs ultimately seize up in a state of absolute digital decay. He discarded his anima, that vital animating spirit we just talked about. In his relentless quest for total mastery, he isolated himself from the collective unconscious, achieving nothing but a state of psychic death. Sure, he is perfectly optimized, but he's entirely empty.
Moving right along, we arrive at Trial 2, the Willionaire and the Empty Bellows.
Escaping that digital decay, our protagonist finds the Willen-Nar, or the fool, living among discarded monuments of sorrow. This trial of monumental sorrow presents a completely different approach to existence. The Fool shares 3 parables that beautifully illustrate how rigid, heavy structures inevitably shatter while the fluid and empty manage to survive the wild wind. The heavy gold crowns of kings sink, while the wet clay mask stays buoyant. A scholar's heavy stone books literally bury him, while the fool's kite just dances in the wind. And a rigid iron fortress shatters in an earthquake while a simple silk tent just flutters and survives. It perfectly captures the profound danger of rigidity. The Fool teaches us a massive lesson here. Psychic emptiness is not a lack. It's actually an openness that keeps us buoyant. Think back to the Clockwork Sovereign's digital decay and his desperate fist of control. Contrast that with the Fool's empty bellows. By flat out refusing to carry those heavy marble blocks of societal duty, those gravestones carried by the living, the Fool achieves a psychic openness that lets the primal surge of life flow right through him without breaking him. Next up is Trial 3, the Pale Inquisitor's Mirror. Our descent gets even darker as we are stalked by the Pale Inquisitor. He represents the ego's trial of judgment and purity, that moment where the psyche attempts to cleanse itself of its shadow through violent perfectionism. He wants to use his razor-sharp quill to carve laws directly into the honest guest, obsessively searching for a hidden stain to punish. He views the raw reality of the ugliest man as a defect that needs fixing. We all know this feeling, right? It's that hypercritical part of our own minds that relentlessly tracks our perceived flaws, absolutely convinced that if we just carve enough rules into ourselves, we can achieve perfect purity. But here is the brilliant twist. The guest doesn't fight back with violence. He simply holds up a mirror, forcing the Inquisitor to see his own repressed terror staring right back at him. The Inquisitor's obsession with finding stains in others, it's just a defense mechanism to hide his own terrifying emptiness. When forced to look into the mirror of the honest guest, the Inquisitor realizes that his obsession with pure, unbroken rules has resulted in a life that has never actually been lived at all. Which brings us to Trial 4, the Pale Redeemer's Pink Syrup.
Shaken by the mirror, we face our fourth trial, and this is a sneaky one. The Pale Redeemer offers an intoxicating sedative escapism. You see, if the ego can't control or judge the shadow, its next move is to just numb it out. This is the ultimate psychological choice. Do you take the pink syrup, or do you bear the burden of authentic tragedy? Remember our philological archaeology? The root los means to loosen. Well, the Redeemer's pink syrup is designed to literally loosen you from reality, offering a hazy, blissful numbness. It's that constant temptation we all face to forget our hunger, look only at the sky, and ignore the dirt below us.
But the honest guest, he completely rejects this hazy numbness. He refuses to drink from the sugar-coated well and become a rotting corpse of false redemption. He chooses instead to embrace his authentic hunger and keep the courage to feel pain. Why would he do that? Because true psychological growth, real individuation, requires us to actually bear the weight of our own tragic realities. To take that pink syrup is to choose a comfortable lie over genuine, grounded existence. Plunging even deeper into the cavernous dungeons, we hit Trial 5, the King's Underground Twin. So when numbing doesn't work, the ego gets desperate. It resorts to direct violence against its own shadow in a terrifying trial of erasure. We meet the king, who raises a golden sword to slay the guest and preserve his own brilliant light. But the guest drops this absolute truth bomb about shadow integration. Sovereignty and dirt are proportional. The king recognizes the honest guest as his underground twin, the foundational shadow holding up the entire kingdom. The ego wants to exist only in the light, but the guest violently reminds him that true sovereignty demands an acceptance of the dirt it's built on. This reveals the fatal flaw in repressing your shadow. You literally cannot destroy your underground twin without destroying yourself. This right here is the absolute core of Jungian and Nietzschean shadow integration, as presented in this fable. The king's attempt to erase the shadow is an act of pure self-destruction because the ego and the shadow are an inseparable substance. To run a sword through the guest is to pierce the host's own chest. And that brings us to the climax, the final trial, shattering the dogma. We finally arrive at the truth-telling monster's banquet of sacred bread. This is the trial of dogmatic condemnation, where the collective societal ego makes its desperate final stand. The high priests are screaming in terror, trying to hide behind their luxurious silk robes rather than face the messy reality of the physical body. They immediately label the honest guest a defilement. These priests represent the rigid, artificial dogmas society uses to cover up primal human nature. They would much rather listen to their own hollow chanting of Latin than acknowledge the genuine, painful truths hidden right under their own floorboards. When you look at the journey as a whole, it perfectly summarizes how every single defense mechanism in the kingdom gets utterly dismantled by the unfiltered truth of the honest guest. From the sovereign's digital decay, to the inquisitor's reflected terror, to the redeemer's rejected escapism, and the king's realization of inseparable substance. Every attempt by the ego to avoid the primal unconscious completely falls apart when confronted by authentic, grounded truth. By having the raw courage to display his hunger, the monstrum completely shatters those artificial dogmas. The high priests, they carry their hunger like a cancer on the inside, rotting away while pretending to be pure. The honest guest is deemed a monster by them simply because he doesn't hide his nature. He fully embraces the tragic, painful, hungry reality of what it actually means to be alive. And this perfectly illustrates the ultimate goal of shadow integration, tearing down the sterile church to let the cold, wild wind of reality back in. It calls all the way back to the fool's parable of psychic openness. By remaining empty of rigid dogmas and false purity, we become instruments for the wild wind of the unconscious, allowing it to play a melody of genuine, unfiltered life. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a chilling question about your own psychological growth. The process of individuation is tough.
It is a literal descent into the dark, Gothic caverns of your own mind. You have to face the clockwork sovereign, the pale inquisitor, and the king within yourself. But tell me, will you drink the pink syrup of false redemption? Or do you have the courage to embrace the honest guest and bear your hunger to the wild wind of reality? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the architecture of truth.